It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about the electoral system and trade unions and why proportional representation matters for trade unions and for workers. And as you'll see on this cover slide, here's an illustration of how rules matter. This is the same map of the same election and the same results, but shown and projected according to different rules. On the right is your familiar geography, and the blue looks big because Tory seats are rural and bigger, Labour seats are densely populated and smaller. And here's the map where a rule is applied to distort the country according to population. Look how much bigger the red areas look. It's the same results with a different rule projecting them. That's how electoral systems matter. The rules we use to determine how we turn votes into seats have all sorts of important impacts on the politics that we get. So there's a very famous quotation from an Italian academic from the 1960s, Giovanni Tory, who said the electoral system is the most specific manipulative instrument in politics. And he didn't use those words by accident. Manipulative. It is a manipulative influence because it manipulates how we get politics and governments out of the choices we make on ballot papers. And it's specific and it's subtle and it's poorly understood, but it's incredibly pervasive. The politics we get is not just about the choices we make, it's about how those choices are turned into seats at Westminster and governments. And the nature of the politics we get is in part a consequence of the rules of the system we use. And that operates at two levels. There's a mechanical effect, which is simply how you do the maths, which is how electoral system rules work. What are the rules that determine who gets a seat given how the votes have been cast? But there's also a more subtle psychological effect. Voters react to the rules that are in place and change their behaviour accordingly. And both of these things are really important. And both of these things under first past the post are not good for progressive forces in politics, including trade unions. They advantage the right and disadvantage the left in all sorts of ways, brute force and subtle. Here's the mechanical effect in action. This graph shows what the current parliament would have looked like under different proportional electoral system rules. Here's what we actually got: 365 Conservative MPs, 203 Labour, 11 Lib Dems, 48 SNP. Under any proportional system, there would not have been a Conservative majority in the House of Commons. Any of the most popular systems, any form of PR, list PR, mixed member PR, single transferable vote, we can talk about these rules. It's not so important. The most important thing is first past the post is an outlier. It's different to all the others. It delivers far more seats for one party, the Conservatives in England, and one party, the SNP in Scotland. And the parties it hurts, not primarily Labour, that's not always true, as you'll see in a minute, but primarily the Liberal Democrats, but also the Greens. But this is in terms of actual votes cast. Remember, a lot of people will not have cast votes for one of these parties because they thought that those parties couldn't win. There's a psychological effect as well. Here's a different way of thinking about this. Brexit has been the big issue on the agenda, obviously, in the last decade. The 2019 election was the Get Brexit Done election. The Conservatives were pursuing a particular hardline view of Brexit. And if we add up the parties that supported Boris Johnson's view of Brexit, the Conservatives, UKIP and the Brexit Party, and then we add up all the parties that supported taking a different approach on Brexit, under first past the post, the Johnson approach to Brexit gets a majority. It does not get a majority under any other electoral system. Now, people take different views on Brexit. Maybe you'll regard this as a positive outcome. But the point is, this is after people have expressed their views in the ballot box. This is a consequence of the rules we use to aggregate those views up. These are the same views expressed in the same seats by the same voters. And in these situations, you have a majority for an alternative approach to Johnson. In this situation, you have a majority for Johnson. That's the rules only delivering those different outcomes. Now, the electoral system is seldom fair to either main party, and when it is, it's kind of by accident. And that bias over the very long run, if we take all the elections since 1950, most of the time, the electoral system is biased against Labour. On this graph, bias against Labour in favour of the Conservatives is the bottom half, bias in favour of Labour is the top half. The only exception in the last 80 years or so was the New Labour years, where Labour's vote became very spread out, very efficient for reasons I'll look at. In all of these other elections, Labour was not getting a fair return on seats for the votes cast. Conservative votes were delivering more seats and Labour votes were delivering less seats. That is not a fair system. It's starting the 100-yard dash, 5 yards back, 10 yards back. And it's not a consistent system either. This graph shows the results of an exercise that John Curtis and colleagues have been doing for decades now, where they say, what would have happened in the general election we've just had if the vote share of the two biggest parties was exactly tied? So if the Conservatives were, say, on 40% and Labour were on 30%, he knocks 5% off the Conservatives everywhere and adds 5% to Labour everywhere, and then looks at how many seats that result would deliver. So in other words, this should be a dead heat result. If the system was fair, it would be a dead heat result in seats. And as you see, occasionally it is. In 1987, it's pretty much a dead heat. 2017, it's pretty much a dead heat. But in many of these elections, instead, one of the parties has a big lead on seats, even though the result is by design a dead heat on votes. Tony Blair did very well on this measure during the New Labour years, because during that period, the Conservative vote was all piled up in the sort of home counties, traditional Tory, two cars in the drive type seats. These days, the thing tends to be biased rather more towards the Conservatives and against Labour for a similar reason. It's now Labour votes that tend to pile up. But the crucial point here is it's not fair. It's not fair to Labour on average in the long run, and it's not even consistent. If I was to say to you, we've got a rule for choosing things, and that rule can deliver anything between a massive advantage for one party and a massive advantage for another party on a tied result, and you know that will swing massively from one election to the next, to go from a 50-seat advantage for Labour to a 50-seat advantage for the Conservatives between two elections on a tied vote. You wouldn't say that's a particularly fair or consistent way to make choices. Doesn't look like a particularly fair rule. Doesn't look like a particularly consistent rule. Which brings us to where we are today. So as well as historically being unfair to Labour, the system is right now unfair to Labour for at least three reasons. The Labour vote is currently inefficiently distributed because there are a lot of votes piled up in urban core seats with big majorities. It's also inefficiently distributed because right now there are lots of seats where Labour narrowly loses to a third party, particularly towards the SNP in Scotland. Lots and lots of Scottish Labour votes, contributing very few seats. And it's inefficiently distributed because of the boundary changes, which are going to reduce the number of MPs returned by Labour-leaning areas where the number of votes has traditionally been lower, particularly Wales. And Sir John Curtis, who many of you will know as the kind of doyen of electoral research and election night analysis and so on, he's been quoted as saying that as things stand right now, for any given performance, the electoral system is inclined to reward the Conservatives more richly than Labour. If the vote shares were tied next time, the Conservatives would have 23 more seats than Labour. On a uniform swing, the Conservatives would need to lead by 3.5 points to get a majority. Now, obviously, that looks a long way from where they are right now, but think a cycle ahead. 3.5 point lead gets them ahead. What did Labour need? 12.3 points lead. So it's saying, oh, well, I get to win the 100 meters if I run it in 12 seconds, but you don't get to win unless you run it in 9.5 seconds. That's the rule. Sorry. That's what we have now. It's not fair. It doesn't treat the parties equally. And there's a whole range of situations, and this has happened historically, where Labour lead on votes. They get more votes, but the Conservatives get more seats in the Commons. That's the system we have. That's the rules we have in place right now. One of the big reasons for this is that the Labour vote is too concentrated. Most of the safest seats are Labour. Now, this is inefficient under first past the post, and it's also unlikely to change, because if we think about where these places are, it's the centre of Liverpool, the centre of Manchester, the centre of Birmingham, the centre of London, places that are full of workers, students, ethnic minorities, migrants, very heavily Labour, 60% Labour, 70% Labour, 80% Labour. Now, why do all those extra votes for Labour count for nothing? Because they do under the current system, and they will continue to count for nothing unless the current system is changed. All of those extra votes for Labour, all of those voters who want Labour policies, they don't get to contribute anything in the balance of affairs towards getting Labour governments, except for padding out the majority of the MPs fortunate enough to represent their area. That's the situation we have now. That's the geography effect. Now, the case that was often made for first past the post, and still often made for first past the post, is it delivers strong and accountable government. Single party majority governments that can implement their mandates and then go back to the government, go back to the electorate and say, here's what we've done, judge us on our actions. And then voters can essentially say thumbs up or thumbs down. Like the gladiator in the arena goes to the electorate and says, we've done these things, what do you think? And if you don't like it, replace us with another majority government. But first past the post has never really consistently delivered on this ideal. There's only been one occasion since 1945 where a majority government for one party has been replaced by a majority government for the other party, which was 1970. We'll probably get a second instance of this next year. Twice in 85 years is a pretty low hit rate for this particular ideal. In most of the other elections, what you get is some sort of intermediate outcome. Hung parliament, tiny majority, chaotic government. Look at the past 15 years in politics and say, are we really getting strong, accountable one-party government on a consistent basis? No, we are not. And we won't, because territorial fragmentation means there's an awful lot of MPs that aren't Conservative or Labour. That's unlikely to change. It'll ebb and flow a bit. They may well get a fair number of seats back from the SNP this time. The Lib Dems may go up this time. But the world of 1945 or 1951, where practically every MP was Labour or Tory, that's not coming back. And as a result, strong, accountable government isn't going to be an outcome that first past the post can consistently deliver. That's baked into the combination of how the rules work and how the votes are currently distributed and the parties people want to vote for. So the ideal doesn't work. And there's also a lot of arguments against this system. You have a nice vision, a nice ideal that doesn't work, but which overlooks an awful lot of things. For one thing, most of the seats in this country are safe. Now, parties like safe seats because safe seats mean they don't have to worry about fighting and contesting them. But it's not a very democratic situation. It's not a very democratic situation that I can tell you right now how roughly half, maybe more than half of the seats in the next election will vote, even though we're seeing one of the biggest shifts in voting behaviour in 2 generations, according to the polling. Despite that, probably half the people in this country live in seats that are still not likely to change hands. And in many of those seats, there's been no change in who controls the seat for 50 years, 70 years, 100 years. Elections are instead fought for swing voters in marginal seats, which is a completely logical reaction to the rules. Going back to Sartori, there's the mechanical effects, there's the psychological effects. If you're a party strategist, are you going to spend any money in Manchester or in deepest Lincolnshire if you're the Tories? No, you're not. Why would you? It's wasted money. So those voters don't get any contact with the parties. They don't get represented. They don't get their views listened to. Instead, it's the swing voters in the marginal seats who get listened to. And that matters both because it's unfair in itself. Some voters matter more than others. It also matters if you're a trade unionist because what are those seats like? They tend to be more to the right. They tend to have fewer trade union members. They tend to be better off. They tend to be more socially conservative. So the voters in those seats do not reflect the country as a whole. They're systematically different to the country as a whole. And they are the voters that both parties will focus on year in, year out, election in, election out. That means that the groups that concentrate in safe seats, and trade union members are one such group, systematically underrepresented by the system, not by accident, but by design. That's how it works. That's rational behaviour by the parties. Along with this, first past the post, as is well known, raises very big barriers to entry for smaller parties. And that means that voters who want to make different choices can't make different choices because the choices they want to make can't win. And that, again, is unfair in and of itself, and also damaging to the political system, because the people that want those choices on the agenda, they lose faith in the system. One big example right now is green politics. Every European country with a proportional system has a big, vocal, established Green Party with a major presence in Parliament. We don't. It isn't because that kind of politics is less popular here. It's because that kind of politics can't win under this system, because the voters aren't concentrated in the way they need to be outside of Brighton or Bristol. It's because voters who would like to vote for Greens worry that they'll split the left vote and let in the Tories, which in many places they would. So it suppresses change in the system. It suppresses the emergence of new forces articulating new priorities, and it alienates the voters who care about those things. As a result, many studies have shown that first past the post countries have lower turnout, lower engagement with the system, lower satisfaction with democracy. Again, not an accident. It's a clear, easy to understand consequence of the way the system works. And finally, and very importantly for trade unionists, first past the post is the only system that will consistently deliver single party right-wing governments with strongly trade union agendas. I've often seen it said in Labour discussions of electoral reform that first past the post is what got us 1945, it's what got us Attlee, it's what got us the welfare state. Not going to contest any of that, it's true. But first past the post is also what got you Thatcher. And it got you 3 terms of Thatcher versus 1 term of Attlee. The Thatcher governments of the 1980s would not have been possible under a proportional system. It's first past the post that enables that. If you look all the way across Europe at proportional systems, you will not find many examples of right-wing parties governing with majorities and enacting vehemently anti-trade union agendas without restraint, because they can't, because their systems don't allow that. They don't deliver those kinds of majorities. Right-wing governments have to negotiate with other parties, and when they have to negotiate, they have to take more reasonable, moderate, flexible stances. There's a bargain. No bargaining in our system if you get a majority, and that's true for a Labour government that gets a majority, but it's also true for Conservative governments that get a majority. And I think there's been an awful lot too much focusing on hoping for the best when it comes to left politics in Britain, and not enough focus on ensuring against the worst, even though we've experienced more than enough of the worst in, say, the last 50 years. It still seems that we don't realise the importance of the electoral system in enabling that kind of totally restraint-free right-wing government. So that is one of the big cases for trade unions to back electoral reform. If you are a trade union, you want a Labour government with a seat at the table. That is how you get trade union laws changes. This is how you get workers' rights policies through. It's how you get a better and fairer and more representative system. It's how you get redistribution. It's how you get the policies that you want and the representation that you want. You will get that less of the time under the current rules, guaranteed, because the current rules disadvantage the party that is most inclined to deliver that for you most of the time, guaranteed. What we know from comparative research is that on average, in countries with proportional representation, Labour-type parties will have 35% of the ministers. In countries with first-past-the-post systems, they have an average of 23% of the ministers. Less bums on seats at the table where the decisions are made, year in, year out, decade in, decade out. And as I say, part of the reason for that is under first-past-the-post, you'll get single-party Conservative government, which is not something that you see virtually ever under more proportional systems. Along with that, proportional systems also align with or advance many trade union goals, and I would argue the fair and equal representation of voters, trade union voters and other kinds of marginalised groups, is itself an important progressive goal. Now, I want to just unpack a little bit more why it is that First Past the Post delivers this bias towards the Conservatives. Why do they do better under it? Why do they get to form single-party governments under First Past the Post and not under other systems? Stanford University professor from over on the west coast of the US, Jonathan Roddens, looked at this in detail. He said, in every industrialized parliamentary democracy with first past the post electoral systems, the legislator ends up being well to the right of the voters and the cabinet ends up well to the right of the legislature. You start off with a voter that's like right in the middle, and then you get a Tory cabinet, and then you get you get a Trussite parliament and a Tory parliament and a Trussite cabinet. This happens time and time again, and this is down to a couple of factors. The first is the behavioural thing that I mentioned with regards that Giovanni Sartori mentioned. The rules affect how critical groups in the electorate behave, and in particular, it's the kind of progressive middle classes. People like me, an academic living in a nice leafy bit of South Manchester. Not that I'm saying I vote Tory, but people like me. Under First Past the Post, if you're a middle class voter on a high income and you're faced with a choice between a right-wing government that will keep your taxes down but cut public services that you don't use very much, or a left-wing government that's going to take money away from you, you tend to leap right. This is the basic psychological insight that's behind the endless Labour double whammy of tax increases, tax bombshell posters, which have been seen in elections for decades and decades in this country. Put the fear of God up the middle classes that they're going to get their taxes hiked up, and they'll basically jump in with the Conservatives, even though they don't like a lot of the things the Conservatives say. Under PR, that doesn't happen, because middle class voters will say, I don't have to vote for this right-wing Tory government that I don't particularly like. There's another party in the middle here that I can vote for. Moderate, liberal parties, green parties too, because that kind of politics is also popular with progressive middle class types. And those parties basically say, we'll look after you guys, but then we'll decide, we'll bargain. We might throw in with the right, we might throw in with the left. And the net consequence of that is very clear. More left-wing governments, because the centre-left party, the equivalent of the Labour Party in all of these different countries, generally the largest party on the left. So which PMs get installed when these moderate liberal parties come in behind them? Centre-left PMs, Labour equivalent PMs. So quite simple. Under First Past the Post, you get more right-wing PMs and more single-party Tory governments. Under PR, you get more left-wing PMs heading left-wing coalitions. Another thing that contributes to this is the geography. This comes back to Liverpool and Manchester and London. Under FPP, all of those extra Labour votes in Liverpool and Manchester and London are contributing not a single extra MP on the left side of the Commons. Under PR, they do. All of those votes count under PR, and all of those votes help to add extra legislators. So it changes the balance of power delivered by the electoral rules. Even aside from all this negotiation stuff, it changes the maths. And when you add up these effects, they are profound. So if you look at how centre-left and centre-right parties have done in first past the post countries over, say, the last 70 years or so, they average a similar share of the vote over the very long run. But right-wing governments govern 2/3 of the time. Not half, which is what their vote shares would suggest, 2/3. And think about the cumulative effect of all those extra years of single-party right-wing government. All of those years, which could have instead been centre-left coalitions. Think about how much that moves the dial on things that progressives and trade unions care about year after year after year. So I also wanted to make the point about values. And I want to pay tribute to Owen Winter, who worked with these organisations when I was first putting together these slides, who went and did a big literature review on this. I knew that the evidence on this was strong, but I was impressed and surprised just how strong it is. When we have looked at how progressive outcomes get delivered, what we find is systematically evidence that proportional systems are the better mechanism for delivering progressive goals, both in terms of democracy itself, turning voters out, engaging them with the system, ensuring that they feel represented, and in terms of who gets represented, women, ethnic minorities, left-wing voters in urban areas, and in terms of progressive economic outcomes, lower income inequality, greater redistribution, more comprehensive welfare state. Why? Because you get more left-wing governments. And in terms of trade union politics, higher trade union membership, higher trade union coverage, higher trade union influence, more favourable labour laws, and more collective bargaining. These are all things that happen more often under under proportional systems than under first-past-the-post systems. For example, the International Trade Union Confederation put together an index for global worker rights. All of the countries that use PR score in the top two, all but one, in the top two categories of the index. All of the regular violators are first-past-the-post systems, including, sad to say, the UK, along with Canada and Australia, two countries that we've bequeathed majoritarian systems to. Australia's is a bit different. It's not quite the same as ours, but it's still majoritarian. We can get into that in discussion if you want. But again, the point is this is not happening by accident. It follows logically from the other points I've made about how the system works in terms of how it turns votes into power, into representation. Now, a couple of questions that get raised a lot in these discussions when I've done them before. So I've added some thoughts on these to head off the two most popular questions raised. The first is, what about the radical right, the far right, call it what you will, UKIP, Reform UK, Brexit Party, further back, BNP, National Front. Is it not the case that a proportional system will mean more of those people in Parliament? Yes, I'm not going to deny that. There's no point in denying that. It's an obvious and self-evident truth. Every proportional country in Europe has one of these parties. But a couple of points I'd make on this. Point number one, that is not the only group that benefits from PR. And it's a weird inversion. When it comes to the benefits of a majoritarian system, centre-left people are like, oh, look at Clement Attlee. Look at the 1945 government, and they forget all of the majority Tory governments. Then when they look at the drawbacks, they say, oh, what about the radical right? And they forget all the beneficiaries on the other side. Greens, Lib Dems, parties further to the left of Labour could well exist in a proportional system in a way that they don't in first-past-the-post right now. Most countries in Europe have a big Green Party. Many parties in Europe have a big radical left party. Most parties in Europe have a big progressive liberal party. We don't have any of those things. We could have them, and we would have them in all likelihood under PR, as well as a radical right party. You get the one, but you also get the other. And it's important to remember it's a package deal. And you're delivering that package deal. And here's the second point I made. It's a substantive point, because that is what voters want. The radical right has risen everywhere in Europe. First-past-the-post did not prevent UKIP getting 14% of the vote in 2015, which is very much in line with the average kind of radical right vote everywhere in Europe. And I don't think using the rules to suppress what's out there in the electorate is a healthy or viable way to deal with these kind of challenges anyway. The right way to deal with these challenges is to confront them head on. And there's one final point I'll make about this. If you were to say to me, well, the good thing about first-past-the-post is it's kept the radical right out of politics, my first response would be, where have you been the last 10 years? Are you really telling me that first-past-the-post has kept radical right influence out of our politics? Are you really telling me that Nigel Farage has had no influence on what's happened in this country in the last 10 years, that he's been sat there powerless simply because he doesn't have a seat in Parliament? The missing link here is that you don't have to be in Parliament to influence those who are. Conservative Party of 2024 looks to me like the UKIP of 2013 in very many respects. And that influence is clear and it's open and it's obvious. You've got Suella Braverman talking at the National Conservative Conference in Brussels today. That would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a former Home Secretary at a kind of far-right jamboree. That's where we are. So if you think first-past-the-post has kept the radical right out of politics, my question to you is, where have you been? Are you really telling me that this has worked? Because I don't think it has. Now, second question, what about the constituency link? Is it not the case that this vital link between MPs and constituents will be lost under PR? And my answer there is quite simple, no. There's no reason you have to break the constituency link in order to deliver a more proportional system. If you like the constituency link, and I like the constituency link, so I'm right with you on this, you can keep it. And in fact, you can improve it. So there are plenty of systems that have constituency MPs. The mixed member systems in Scotland and Wales have constituency MPs, and the single transferable systems in, say, Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, and now in Scottish local elections, they have slightly larger constituencies with multiple local MPs. And either of those systems, in principle, makes the constituency link stronger. Imagine you are living in a safe seat where you've got an MP who's kind of just tuned out and is not bothering to respond to constituent issues anymore. What are you going to do? You've not got any other MPs you can approach. If you're in a mixed member system or a single transferable vote system, you've got multiple constituency MPs, often from different political parties that you can approach for help with the problems that you've got. And those MPs are going to have a stronger incentive to listen to you, because if they don't, they risk losing out to one of their competitors who is listening to you, because they no longer have the safety blanket of a safe seat like they did under the other systems. So you like the constituency link? Great. So do I. I think it's a very valuable part of our politics. So let's make sure we design a fairer and better system that keeps it. That is not difficult. There are systems that do that already, including here in the UK, within the devolved governments, within local government. So finally, a little bit about New Zealand. A country I love. I'm a big fan of things like Flight of the Conchords, Taika Waititi and so on, but also a big fan of them because they're the only country that have in modern times switched from first past the post to a PR system. They did this in 1996. Most of the MPs are still constituency MPs, 72 constituency MPs, 51 get elected off the list. Since that's happened, large majorities of voters have consistently said they prefer the new system. They don't want to go back, nor do the political parties want to go back. 54% back change in the original referendum that delivered it in 1993. And then when they were asked again, after 25 years of operating under it, or 15 years of operating under it, 2011, 58% backed it. It got more popular. How many things in politics get more popular after voters have been exposed to them for 15 years? Well, this did. And why? Because it delivered what it said it was going to deliver. The results are fairer. A bigger and more ideologically diverse range of parties get represented. But this didn't come at the cost of clear and accountable government. The traditional big two parties of New Zealand, they have a Labour Party and they have something I think is called the National Party. They continue to lead all the governments, provided all the prime ministers. Still strong and accountable government, but broader and more diverse and more representative government on top of it. You can have your cake and eat it. More representation of women, more representation of ethnic minorities, especially Maori, and more Labour governments. The National Party was in power for 74% of the time in the 47 years before PR was introduced. Labour has governed for half of the time since. It's levelled the playing field. And one of the researchers who researched this for decades and argued for it, Jack Vowles, proud Kiwi, said all of the most important expectations of New Zealand's electoral reformers were met. Change is possible. Change has happened. New Zealand shows it. And it has mattered for trade unions in New Zealand. After PR was introduced, the relationship between New Zealand Labour and trade unions got stronger. And the Labour Party, which had been a quite Blairite party in the first-past-the-post years of the 1990s, just like our Labour Party, very focused on those centre-right swing voters, free markets, don't want to be too close to the unions, don't want to be damaging our reputation with the critical swing seats. That changed under PR. Labour instead formed a government with a party to its left and ended up repealing some of the most restrictive trade union legislation that the right-wing parties had been brought in. And since 2000, under PR, New Zealand Labour governments have introduced legislation on paid parental leave, equal employment opportunities, rest breaks and breastfeeding, flexible working relations. And they have been nicer about trade unions, even in their manifestos. This is a bar chart, again, I owe this to Owen, that looks at positive and negative mentions of trade unions or workers' rights in New Zealand manifesto since 1946. Here's the FPP period, and even the Labour Party is not saying many kind things about trade unions. Switch to PR, the number of positive mentions about trade unions and workers' rights shoots right up. And again, the logic is clear. You need to show that you're representing these people because they have a viable option for going elsewhere. They could go to parties to the left of Labour. And the threat of, majority centre-right government is no longer there. So the incentives line up. And when the incentives line up, parties' behaviour changes. And who benefits? Well, trade unions, for one thing. So I'll stop there. I think I've talked slightly longer than I'm supposed to already, so I'd like to get over to your questions. So let me just stop the share of the screen here. Two things on this. Firstly, delivery is what matters and experience is what matters. So if people experience competent and effective coalition government that represents and delivers, then they'll like it. That's what happened in New Zealand. It's not like the New Zealanders didn't get exposed to these kinds of arguments as well. And I think, as well as, clever slogans, coalition competence, stuff like that, also point to countries all over the world. And in Britain, we're way too fond of always just looking across the Atlantic at the US, when there's great examples of very effective coalition governments just across the North Sea, in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark. I think in most countries, it's well established which parties are most likely to form coalitions with each other. They tend to form into so-called blocs. And of course, a lot of that negotiation can take place ahead of time. Sometimes it is affected by the result. So do unexpected coalitions sometimes form? Yes. Does negotiating a coalition take longer? Also, yes. But I think we're remarkably impatient in this country. It's an aspect of our political culture, which incidentally many other countries find very puzzling. You're talking about changing the fundamental laws of the land over the coming 5 years. Who owns what? Who gets what? What money is spent on vital public services that are literally a life and death matter? And you're not willing to spend a few weeks talking it out, figuring out how to get that program right. That to many people in continental Europe is something they find very hard to understand. So would there be longer coalition negotiations? Yes. I accept that's one of the unavoidable trade-offs of more coalition governments. Do I think that's a price worth paying? On the whole, yes, because I think that the negotiation process, incidentally, will often deliver better policy. How much bad law and bad policy have we seen rushed through by governments with a majority in a hurry in this country? Would it really have been so bad to spend a little bit longer hashing it all out and thinking about the detail? I'm not certain it would have been. The other thing is, often the best form of defense is attack. Who are the people making these arguments? It's always conservatives with their unrepresentative, extreme, single-party governments. Why is that seen as a good outcome? Why are they claiming that's a good outcome? And particularly right now, when I think the electorate is more aware than usual of the costs of single-party conservative government, underline that handing full power to an unrepresentative minority of people elected on an unrepresentative minority of votes and giving them free rein to do whatever the hell they want, that's not delivering for democracy. That's not delivering for stability. That's not delivering for competence. So why give them the freedom to define the status quo as, oh, single party government's good, coalition's bad? Well, sorry, guys, most of the world disagrees. Are you saying they're all wrong? I don't agree, actually. I think that is one of the scenarios in which we may get constitutional reform. But I could give you a couple of other ones. The first is this stuff doesn't have to happen in one great big heave. One of the things we've seen a lot of in Britain in the last 30 years or so is kind of incremental constitutional change. Scotland gets a parliament, Wales gets an assembly, the Welsh assembly gets more powers, the Scottish parliament gets more powers. Now we have combined authorities as well. Now we have a proportional voting system in Scottish local elections. We have Wales enabling local authorities to switch to a proportional system as well. So one option is that it goes incrementally, that it isn't one big heave, it's lots of little changes. A second option is you have a government that, although it's won a majority, doesn't have a very big majority and has an organised and vocal faction within it in the legislature who thinks electoral reform is important for many of the reasons that I've laid out. And you have a leadership that's sympathetic to it. In that kind of situation, you could get change even after an election that's delivered a majority. Now, do I think that the chances of constitutional reform go down as the size of a majority goes up? Yes, I do. But that doesn't mean that it's hung parliament means reform, everything else means no hope. I don't think that's true. I think it's more nuanced than that. Thresholds for representation in parliament, which are very commonly used, 5% threshold, 10% threshold before you get any representation. I think that's a very good way of limiting fragmentation. And, you know, we can debate the finer points of these things. I certainly think any argument, any proposals for a proportional system should take that point head on. Too much fragmentation can become a problem and can produce instability. So the very low threshold systems we have, like the Netherlands or Israel, those are not great because you just have very unwieldy, very unstable coalitions. There's always the risk of people defecting and stuff like this. So, like so many things in life, you know, you don't want the porridge to be too hot or too cold. It's got to be just right. So you've got to seek a system that's more representative, but not to the extent of really fragmenting things. So I think my view is thresholds are a better way to get to that outcome, but I'm not going to, you know, nail my colours to the wall on that as the only option. I think it's one to debate. One thing I can say from the lessons in other countries is that it's very often the case that you have more than one party on the left, and that you'll have a centre left party and a more radical left party, either more radical in the traditional economic sense, you know, much stronger views on public ownership, redistribution, and so on, or more radical on environmental politics and so on, because the barriers to getting that set up are lower. So it would certainly make it a lot easier for people who wanted to set up a party to the left of Labour to be able to get such a thing off the ground and get that represented in Parliament, provided, of course, and that's the critical thing, that they can get critical mass of support from the electorate at large. One recent example that's very prominent in my head, because my wife's Polish. So the Poles had an election last year, and they have a form of PR, and their ruling radical right government that's been in charge for 8 years and has been doing everything it can to rig everything in its favour, the judiciary, the media, and so on. They lost, but they only lost because the system was proportional. If they'd have had the first past the post system that we have in this country, they'd have a majority government right now with exactly the same pattern of votes cast. Because Poland's proportional electoral system enabled three distinct parties that were opposed to that radical right government to compete separately for different kinds of voters, then come together to form a coalition. They were able to overcome all the advantages that that government had in terms of the media, in terms of the judiciary, in terms of the coverage they were getting, in terms of the campaign finance. If it had been first past the post, it would have been game over for them. And Hungary was cited as another example. Viktor Orban has repeatedly and very cleverly changed the electoral rules in ways that helped keep him in power, because he's one of the politicians who recognizes the unique and subtle power that these rules can have. Put bluntly, he's just a lot smarter than the people who are in charge of law and justice in Poland. And if they'd have been as smart as him about changing electoral rules, they'd still be in charge right now. That's how important electoral rules can be. That's an interesting one. I've not heard that one before. I'm not sure. I think that potentially it could be, partly because established parties of the centre left, the Labour Party obviously has strong links with many trade unions. They will have a stronger incentive to recruit and engage trade unionists because they'll be more worried about challenges to their left that unions could play an important role organising, coming back to our earlier question. And of course, if you were wanting to start up a new party somewhere on the left of politics, trade unions could be a very powerful organisational infrastructure for you. So you'll be keen to, you know, newer parties could be keen to engage with unions for that reason too. So yeah, because trade unions offer a lot to parties in terms of organisation, infrastructure, membership, and so on, in a more competitive political system with more options on the left, probably you're going to get unions getting engaged more, and the quid pro quo is therefore parties will probably be helping unions in terms of process of recruiting members and so on. So it's all a bit speculative. It's not something I've actually thought through in any great detail. I'd be curious if there's research on it. I don't know, but I can see ways in which it could work. Absolutely. In fact, coming back to the point about incremental versus big leap change, I often wonder if this might be the place to start for PR reformers, because so many of our towns and cities are political monocultures. I live in one. I mean, Manchester Labour Party are great, don't get me wrong. The current Manchester head of Manchester Council, Bev Hughes, she's a graduate of the Department of Politics, my department at the University of Manchester, so obviously delivering great governance, very well informed. But it's nearly all Labour. I think there are 2 Lib Dem councillors and that's it. And there's lots of councillors like that, all Labour or all Tory, sometimes even all Lib Dem. And I don't think that's very representative of the diversity of opinion in these places. I don't think it's very healthy either for parties to have essentially no competing voices, no alternative voices, holding them to account, challenging them, offering something different. And PR in local government would deliver a great deal more diversity within those political ecosystems. It would avoid these monocultures that can often lead to groupthink, can often lead to very factionalized politics, because really it's all about who's in and who's out within the ruling party. That's the only question that matters in terms of power in these places, decade in, decade out. And we can do much better and have much healthier local politics if we had a more proportional system. So I'd absolutely be in favour of it for local government. And I think it could even provide a test case to prove the benefits of a more proportional system in helping to make the case for using it in Westminster elections. On a number of indicators, the balance of support for change to the electoral system is stronger within Labour than it was the last time Labour were in power. There's more support for electoral reform within the trade union movement now than there was in the late 90s or the early 2000s. There's more support within the membership. The members passed a motion at conference in favour of electoral reform, I think 2 years ago now. That had not happened in the run-up to the 1990s Labour government. There's more support in public opinion generally. There's a lot of support for more MPs as well. They've seen the kind of harm that our current system can do, and the kinds of governments that it can elect that wouldn't happen otherwise in the last 10 years. So I think there's an awful lot more on the kind of positive side of the ledger than there used to be. But there's one big thing on the other side of the ledger, which is this will be a Labour government that has a heck of a lot to do. A lot of dumpster fires, a lot of big in trays. And there's a risk that this ends up getting pushed down the list of priorities, and the pendulum will swing. We live in more volatile politics. It may swing after even one term. You know, we're likely to go from a Tory majority government to a Labour majority government this time. Don't count out the possibility of it swinging all the way back in one term next time. There's a risk potentially of Labour saying, well, we agree with all this stuff in principle, but it's complicated and tricky and it's not a priority, so we'll do it in the second term, and then they don't get a second term. So I agree, that is a risk. It's a substantial risk. But I think to just keep making the case that this is a really important way to cement the kinds of changes that Labour wants to see in our society, because currently what happens is anything that a Labour government does can get undone by the next Conservative government. Take Sure Start, marvellous policy, completely undone by the Conservatives. All the extra investment in the NHS, unwound by the Conservative. Building schools for the future, junked very early on in the coalition. If you have a proportional electoral system, you have a mechanism to try and bed those things in, because the Conservatives won't just be able to govern alone. They'll have to negotiate with other parties who will often share Labour's view on the value of these things. It's a way of preserving and entrenching changes that progressives of all kinds want to see. So that would probably be the argument I would make, that I think might be most resonant with the people currently in charge. But you know, to come back to my first point, I'm an academic, I'm not good at this stuff, so I wouldn't say it's necessarily the right one. That's a good question. I mean, there's a kind of norm that has set in that if you make constitutional changes, you need to have a referendum. We did it with setting up the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, and we did it on the AV thing. We did it on Brexit. But people forget there have been plenty of other pretty substantial changes that weren't done with a referendum. I don't think there was a referendum to set up the London Assembly. There wasn't referendums to set up the combined authorities. The change in the electoral system for mayors that we've just had, no referendum on that. No referendum on the introduction of a more proportional system in Scottish local elections and so on. The other argument that can be made, and this is kind of part of what the New Zealanders did. I mean, they did have a referendum to introduce it, but actually, a couple more points on referendums. One thing I think the New Zealanders did, which I really liked, is they thought very carefully about what they wanted to ask people in the referendum, which is a lesson we could do with learning after 2016. They first asked them, do you think we should keep the current electoral system? That was vote number one. And the New Zealanders said no. And then they said, which system would you like to switch to? Do you think this system we're proposing, do you want this? And that's how they got the system. And then they had another referendum on whether to keep it later on. I think I would learn from that sequencing process. I think if you were to put to people the idea, do we need to change the electoral system? You would get a majority for that. And then I think you could bring in and test out a new system with the promise to have a referendum on whether to keep it or revert to the system you had before. Because people have a lot of status quo bias. They'll worry about changes to an electoral system hurting things they like about politics, like the constituency link that we discussed. If they see that the new system preserves the things they like and delivers other things that they also like, then they'll come around in favour of it, just as the New Zealanders, a bigger majority for keeping the system once it was there than there was for introducing it in the first place. So I would think carefully about the role that a referendum could play. It's probably such a big change that a referendum of some kind needs to happen, but there are different ways to stage and organise that.